He is the central figure of Christianity. Most scholars agree that he was a Jewish rabbi from Galilee who traveled the countryside and preached his message of faith, love, hope, and adherence to biblical scriptures. He is considered by many to be a deity, to others a revolutionary figure, and even more see him as just a man who had his flaws and still managed to be seen as the Son of God. A new original series is set for premiere on CNN March 1st that will employ science and research to uncover just who he really was. Finding Jesus, Faith, Fact, and Forgery will seek to bring a clearer understanding of the man. Now it's time to welcome the author of the book who's involved in this effort, Michael McKinley, an award-winning author, filmmaker, and screenwriter who has penned several documentaries for CNN. He is one of the co-authors. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Mike, what is it that we still need to know and understand about Jesus Christ? Because you certainly heard me say that this has been centuries now. We thought we knew everything there was to know.
Well, I think that everyone, in a way, thinks they know who Jesus is. And yet, in doing these films about him, we have found out there's a lot more out there than we think we know. And so even asking the question is worth doing, just to find out what it is the world is engaged in now in terms of trying to understand further the greatest man in history who we think left nothing behind.
Now, the name of the book is Faith, Fact, and Forgery. Let's focus on that because over the centuries, I would imagine, and certainly I've done some readings, but not the research that you have done, there have been tremendous amounts of forgeries, things that have been found to be not real. For instance, isn't there still a big question about whether or not the Shroud of Turin is actually the shroud that Jesus wore when he was buried?
There is. The shroud, in fact, is a great example because it was science that deepened the mystery of the shroud when, at the end of the 19th century, a photograph was taken of the shroud, and lo and behold, the image of Jesus, or the face purportedly of Jesus, was seen more clearly than it had ever been in the negatives of the photograph. And from there, science picked up the challenge, if you will, to prove what faith had always believed. Science has not proven it yet, but the more advanced science gets, the deeper the mystery gets when it comes to the shroud.
Is there almost a reticence, if you will, from some people to know more and to have science get involved? The reason I ask is because I have a friend of mine who studies a lot of biblical history, and even she said, I don't really want science involved. I'm a little bit afraid of what it might show us and might actually reveal.
I think that's certainly a school of thought, but I also think by the same token, science can certainly bolster faith if you set out with a purity of heart, if you will. And that's what we did in telling our story. There was no agenda other than to use whatever tools we had at our disposal, be they new scholarship in history, theology, or science, to probe the mysteries to a greater depth. And I think science can greatly be in service of that.
Now, the first episode is on the Shroud of Turin. So give us an idea, if you will, about the science that you put to work here and the people that you had involved and what exactly, of course, without giving away and being a complete spoiler alert here, I guess, for the first episode, what you were trying to do and what you were trying to learn.
Well, I think that the general thing with the entire series was we looked at each of our 6 objects through 3 lenses. What was it of its time and its connection to Jesus? What's that story? The second one is, how did it get from first century Israel to now? And the third one is, what does science have to say about it? So in telling the shroud story, we do all 3 of those things. And the science of the shroud looks at it historically, from the photograph by Secondo Pia, the Italian photographer at the end of the 19th century, on through the tests done by physicists connected to the US Air Force in the 1970s and 80s, and they ended up finding the Shroud of Turin research project, which led to the carbon testing of the shroud in the 1980s, whose results came back and said that it was a medieval forgery. But then the jury went back out on that because the portion of the shroud that was tested was contaminated through centuries. It was taken from the edge of the shroud and contaminated by wear and tear. And so then we look at, and again, without giving away that first episode, other theories about how the shroud might have been forged or how it might not have been, and just misdated through its connection to something called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which in the Gospel of John there are 2 cloths found in the tomb of Jesus. One is the burial shroud, and the other is a face cloth, if you will, that was wrapped around his head after he had died. and the blood stains on the sudarium match those of the shroud, as does the blood type. So that's a very new and provocative theory about how the two might be connected. And the first evidence of the sudarium appears in the 6th century.
Mike, do you think now that with America, so many things happening now, we're led to understand by a number of different stats and a number of different polls that there is a greater belief now in faith in this country now? Now faith is growing in so many different ways, certainly in its politics and what people want them involved in. But what we're at right now is a time where people want to know more of the truth about Jesus. They want to know who he is, perhaps in a relevant sense, maybe even prove that he was a man, that he was just a man who maybe had his faults like everybody else, but had a much greater purpose at the end of his life.
I think most certainly, and I think that we're at a very exciting time in our history in that we have so many ways to approach that subject and so many much more powerful tools to do it. And at the same time are living in a world that is so religiously charged by other faiths, as we know, geopolitically. So I think that only sharpens our focus to know in a country that is, whose majority is Christian, as the United States, exactly who it is who was this man Jesus, and how much more can we know about him.
Let me ask you from a personal standpoint here, what did you learn? I mean, were you even surprised at some of the things that you had uncovered here, and are you a man of faith who was caught by it?
I think that every time I've done, this is the 4th film I've been involved in on biblical archaeology connected to the historical Jesus, and each time I've discovered something new. I think that the most personally surprising thing to me was the power of the shroud, to be honest. The more that we researched the shroud and used the tools of science, and followed the story through history, the more powerful that story became and the deeper the mystery became. And it was something that I thought that I had already concluded on. The shroud may well be a forgery, but I've reversed myself on that now, and I don't think that's true.
So many mysteries that we still have to learn about a man who simply speaks to so much of the planet. The book, once again, is Finding Jesus, Faith, Fact, and Forgery. I want to remind everybody that the CNN series begins on March the 1st, and already it sounds like a fascinating examination of who this man was and a little bit more about what he means to all our lives.
Great.
Michael McKinley, want to thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with the series. We'll be watching.
Great. Thank you very much it was my pleasure.
My pleasure. Take care. All right, now, hold tight to that green or gold credit card in your wallet because the cost of doing business is going up. We head to the land of Bulls, Bears, and Bucks right after the break, right here on MidPoint.